All right, everyone. So we're going to get started in just a quick second. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Right now, everybody should be on mute, but I definitely want this to be interactive. So as we get going, please unmute yourself and ask some questions. But as is the case with Lunch and Learn, sometimes we're at home, and so maybe there's a dog barking. Sometimes we are at work, and we can't really talk. Sometimes we're literally eating lunch, and so you're crunching away on some Cool Ranch Doritos. And so maybe we just don't want that crunching to be interfering with other folks as we get going through this. So let's do this. Let's have everybody, if you can hear me, if you can see my screen, it says rental property analysis, jump into the chat. Give me a quick good afternoon, Justin. I see you, I hear you, all that stuff. Let me know that everybody's in here and can start seeing this stuff. I wanna make sure that everybody, that we're all on the same page before we get going here. A lot of folks are jumping in. Oh, look at you guys, beautiful, awesome response. Thank you, everyone. Cool, so let's give it just another minute here. We got a few more jumping in. Looks like we're gonna have a great turnout. We actually had like 50 registers, so I'm super excited to be talking to you all today and seeing what we can do and where we're gonna go with this. And so I've been working on this for a long time, but then again, on the other hand, I kind of threw this together last minute. So hopefully my math is all right. Hopefully the spelling is correct. We're not going to go into every single different way to analyze rental properties, but we're going to cover probably the big 3 or 4 ways. And I'm excited to be sharing this all with you. So with that, we've got, the waiting room keeps filling up, and I'm letting everybody in here. All right. And so I am Justin Cooper. I think under my face there, if you can see it, it says Sean, but I logged in under Sean. I cheated a little bit. But this is Justin. And so to start chatting a little bit, we are here today talking about rental property analysis, how to analyze a rental property. And I am Justin Cooper with Pine Financial Group. Pine Financial is hosting the Lunch and Learns. As you may know, we've been doing these for the past several weeks, and we're going to continue with them probably till at least the end of the year. We'll see how it keeps going. In addition to the Lunch and Learns, we're putting out a lot of other great content. We're putting out Facebook videos, YouTube videos, sending them out every Friday. We've got our newsletter every month with written content. We publish articles there. Lots of great content and information. And really all of it is geared towards educating you as the investor to make you a better investor. Now, of course, we are hard money lenders. We're not just content creators. And so what we're trying to do with all this content is to make you a better investor so that you want to, do more investing and of course, come and borrow some money from us. So with that said, let's see. Oh, still more in this waiting room. I don't know how to turn off the waiting room, but we're gonna get going here. So that's a little bit about us and why, of course, we're doing these Lunch and Learns. And so with that, let's dive in here a little bit. Let's get going. What are we gonna be talking about today? So we're gonna cover a few formulas. We're going to talk a little bit about Coop's quick 3-step analysis. This is the one that I use personally when I'm buying rental properties. And I'm probably going to be getting ready to buy at least 1 or 2 more here, hopefully by the end of the year, definitely into 2021. Happy to chat a little bit about that if anybody has any questions as to why or how. And then Q&A, and really the question and answer I want spread throughout this whole thing. If anything comes up, just unmute yourself and dive right in. And so that's really what I'm hoping we can do here. Definitely jump into the chat. If you have any questions, type away in there. I got that open and I'm looking, as well as just unmute yourself and start talking. So a little bit about me, if you're not familiar with who I am and why I'm the one here chatting today. I started learning about real estate investing probably back in 2004. I actually have a new project. I just built a new bookshelf and I've been putting all my real estate education and information on there. And I probably have feet and feet and feet of just written notes that I'm going to be going through. And so far, the earliest note I found was from 2004. It could be a little earlier, but I got a fun little end of summer, back to school maybe, project of going through all my old notes. But I did my first flip in 2007, which was not a good deal for me profitability-wise, although it was a great deal for me because it really got me going down the path and doing all this fun, awesome real estate investing stuff. So fell in love with the process, even though I didn't make money, but here I am over a decade later, still doing it and loving it. We have our first rental, my wife and I have our first rental back in 2010. We didn't actually buy it as a rental. We were living in the property. We moved, and then we just kept that property as a rental. And so that was really our first one, which was an awesome experience. Probably spoiled us a little bit because we had such good tenants. And then, of course, in 2011, I joined Pine Financial, which brought me in full time as a real estate investor and, of course, hard money lender. And so over the past decade plus, I've done a handful of fix and flips, all profitable except for that first one. I own a handful of rentals. I managed them all myself for a while until I really convinced myself I am a horrible property manager. And since then, I've turned over almost all of the properties to a property manager. I still have one I manage. I've built new construction projects. I have a self-directed IRA and I use it for real estate. I've bought notes. I've tried my hand at wholesaling. And then something new I've been doing recently is I also do some coaching and consulting. And so what we're talking about today is along those lines, because I coach and consult with folks about buying rental properties. So I've also started a Facebook group. So if anybody's interested, would love to chat with you and get you in there. My contact info was on the first slide. It'll be on the last slide. So if you do want to reach out and see if coaching and support makes sense for you, love to chat. If you want to just join the Facebook group, love to get you a link to that. If you want to talk more about hard money lending and how you can use that to help you with your investing, obviously want to help and talk to you about that as well. But none of that is really what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about how to analyze rental properties. So let's get in there. Formulas, which ones are we talking about? Cash flow. Everybody talks about cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. That is the most important. Whoa, sorry. There we are. Cash flow is always the most important thing, right? When we're talking about buying rental properties. And so we will analyze for some cash flow. Cap rate. I think a lot of us have heard about cap rate. I think there's sometimes some confusion around cap rates, but we'll definitely get into that and talk about how to analyze and figure out the cap rate. Then the GRM, or gross rent multiplier. And I have that as with the 1% rule. And I'll talk about why I have those together when we get there. And then the cash on cash return. So those are going to be the four things we talk about and look at today. And again, if you have any questions, definitely just unmute yourself and start talking, interrupt me. Feel free to do that. I'd love to have conversations as we're doing this, as well as just jumping into the chat. If you feel better, easier, safer to just type in your questions, that is fine too. All right, cash flow, here we go. First and foremost, we're gonna do the cash flow Coop's way. So I specify that because there's several different ways I think to analyze for cash flow and to work through that. And so for me, what I like to do is I wanna just keep things simple, right? When maybe we talked about some MAO formulas, max allowable offers, and just keeping things simple, using percentages in that regard. When it comes to calculating the cash flow, I want to keep things simple as well. And so what I like to do here is I start with a monthly rent and I subtract our mortgage payment, and that equals cash flow. And now that's going to be gross cash flow. And as I'll show you in a second, I'm leaving out a lot of information. And so what's really important to understand here is once you decide a formula that's right for you, that's the most important thing. And then you stay consistent with that through all your deals and your analysis and all these other moving things, because really it doesn't matter what anybody else does. It doesn't matter how I analyze deals. What matters most is how you analyze deals, and that you're consistent, and then you have criteria that go along with that. Because understanding how to calculate cash flow is one thing, but what do you do with that number once it spits out, right? Some people are okay with negative cash flow. Some are okay with $100 a month, and then some might be okay with a minimum of $500 a month, right? So it all kind of depends. And the most important thing is that you understand what's important for you. That's what it comes down to. So understanding how the formulas work is the first part, but then having your own criteria to support that and play into that is going to be also very important. All right, so my way is just the gross cash flow, just the high end numbers. What's the monthly rent? What does the lease say minus the mortgage payment? That's it, gross numbers. So another way to look at that might be more analytical. We're going to take the NOI, the net operating income, minus the mortgage payment, and that'll equal cash flow. So when I'm saying gross up here in the monthly cash flow, gross is just the top line. The net operating income, net is after some expenses. So what are we looking at here? An NOI is the net operating income, NOI, net operating income of the property. So this is the income after expenses. So how do we figure that out? Pretty simple formula. So far, every formula is pretty easy. But this one, we're gonna take the monthly rent, okay? This is the same as what I take, that gross number, the top line number, okay? Minus the expenses. And so what are the expenses? What do I count there, Justin? First and foremost, property management. Usually property management is between 8 and 10%, okay? Repairs and maintenance. Now this may not be an actual expense every single month. Hopefully your place isn't falling apart 5% every single month. But what we're probably doing is accounting for that, knowing that there's going to be expense. In 4 months, I may have to replace a water heater. In 2 years, I may have to replace a roof. Hopefully in 10 years, when I have a turnover and my tenant moves out, I'm gonna have to remodel the place and bring it back up and modernize it. So we're gonna set money aside for repairs and maintenance. Same thing on vacancies. We're not gonna have vacancy every single month, but we know that the property will be vacant. The tenant will eventually leave. And because of that, we're not gonna have income, but we still have those expenses. And so we're gonna set some money aside, 5%. That's roughly like 18, 19 days a year is what we're assuming there, at least with 5%. Utilities. Now, hopefully the tenant will pay, right? So utilities are generally the water bill, the electric, the gas, these types of things. And so maybe that's the tenant, maybe that's you as the investor. And this is something that will probably be spelled out in your lease and certainly something negotiated and accounted for. So if you're going to be paying the water and utilities, maybe you can charge a little bit higher rent, or because you're having the tenant pay for all these things, maybe you charge a little less in rent to account for that, because their overall housing expense will be somewhere in that area, okay? And so there's some different thoughts around paying for utilities. The big one is paying for the water bill. And sometimes people want to pay for the water themselves. The investor wants to pay for the water themselves because there's a chance that the water company can put a lien on your property. So if you or your tenant doesn't pay the water bill, they can put a lien against your property, okay? Just like a mortgage is a lien, they can do that as well for the water bill. And so maybe it's only a couple $100. Maybe if you go for a long time, it's then in the thousands of dollars, maybe extra fees. And so the last thing we want is to have that be accruing. We go to try and sell the property, and now we have a clouded title, right? We're having issues selling the property. We're not gonna net the same that we thought because there's a lien against the property because of the water. And so sometimes what folks will do, is, investors will pay for that themselves, alleviating that. Sometimes what folks can do is simply add themselves or their business to the water bill, so that they will also know, not necessarily being responsible for it, but that they're being told what's going on. Is the tenant paying this or not, so that they can stay ahead of these things. So a couple different takes on what and how we should do the utilities. HOA, right, homeowners associations. This is typically more for condos and townhomes, but sometimes single family residences, can be in an HOA. So you got to understand that and account for that. Taxes and insurance. Typically, if we have a mortgage, the taxes and insurance are rolled into that mortgage payment. So of course, a mortgage payment, sometimes we call it the PITI. And so the PI is the principal and interest. That's the actual loan amount. But then they're also escrowing for the T and I, the taxes and insurance. And so you got to be careful, as we're creating these formulas for ourselves, that we're not going to be double dipping, all right? That we're going to make sure if I'm accounting for the taxes and insurance in the expenses, or am I accounting for it in the mortgage payments? So you don't want to be double billing yourself, because that could obviously change your formula, how the deal looks, and then ultimately you may not hit your criteria. So we got to be careful on that. So expenses, we understand these are the typical expenses in owning a rental property. We figure that out, subtract that from the monthly rent. It produces our NOI, our net operating income. And then we can take that NOI and pull it back up into the up here into the cash flow. And so we take our NOI now minus the mortgage payment equals our cash flow. All right. And so a note here, I'm moving a lot faster. I'm not going through all this extra analysis of expenses and calculating all these things and am I gonna pay the water on this one? Can I get the tenant to pay these things, right? I'm not really looking at that. I'm moving a lot quicker up here in my formula and just But because that, if we were to meet up at a RIA, right, at a Real Estate Investor Association group, sometime in the future, and we start talking about our rental properties, and you say, oh man, I found this property and it's going to cash flow $300 a month, and I'm ecstatic. I'm over the moon about this deal. It's going to be so great. And then I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, God, 300 a month, that leaves no room for all these expenses. What a horrible deal. Why would you ever do that? Because maybe my criteria is much higher for the cash flow. But this gets into the nuance of how are we actually running the numbers? Which formula are we doing? When I think $300 a month of cash flow is horrible, that's because I'm looking at gross cash flow. Whereas you may be looking at the net cash flow because you're using this more analytical way. Both are cash flow formulas, both hit our criteria based on what our criteria are. And so I think you got a bad deal, you think you got a great deal, but we're not talking apples to apples, okay? Because we're not using the same formula. So we always have to be careful, and I see this all the time when I do networking, or used to do the networking face-to-face, is people like to talk about the numbers and spit out numbers and make it sound good and great, but they're not really revealing all the behind the scenes stuff that led up to that. And that's okay, we don't have to, right? I'm not buying that deal. I'm not analyzing that deal. I'm not managing it. I'm not trying to profit from it. So what I think kind of doesn't matter to a certain extent, as long as you know what matters and you know the numbers and it makes sense for you and your investing. That's really the thing that matters the most. So before we get moving on to the next one, that's what I want to kind of say quickly about the cash flow formulas. Does anybody have any questions on any of this? So far, so good on the cash flow stuff, understanding, making sense on the formulas. Give me a quick, hear ya, I'm keeping up with you. I like Coop's cash flow. Throw something in the chat there. Let me know you guys are still, that I'm still broadcasting. As I wait for you to type, I'm gonna keep going here. All right, now what I did is I'm gonna take the same stuff and I'm gonna plug in some actual numbers, because sometimes actually seeing the numbers helps formulas make more sense. And so what I'm gonna do here is plug in the last deal I bought. Now this was back in 2018, so not too long ago, but not super recent, but this is the last deal I bought. So the monthly rent was $1,896 a month. The mortgage payment was $905 a month. So for me, my gross cash flow is $991, okay? Now that sounds great. Well, I was excited for it, and hopefully you're excited for it. But now this hits my criteria, because I know in that $991, there's going to be other expenses, but $991 is enough to cover all those other expenses and still make it profitable each month, okay? So for me, this checks that box. It hits my minimum criteria. That's why I moved forward on it. But if we dive a little deeper, okay, let's look a little more analytical. We got the NOI minus the mortgage payment, all right, equals the cash flow. So what does that look like? So the NOI, the net operating income, was $1,354 a month. And of course, the mortgage payment was $905. And then, so my net cash flow is $449, okay? The difference being, to figure this out, I had to do a whole lot more math, right? So in this case, the property management, because I have a property manager on this one, is $152 a month. For me, that's 8%, okay? So 8% of $1,896 is $152 a month. The repairs and maintenance that I might be setting aside, 5%, that's $95 a month. Same thing with the vacancies, 5% is what I was calculating. So $95 there. Utilities, none. So there is an HOA, and so the HOA covers some and the tenant covers some, but out of my pocket, no utilities are being paid. The HOA is $200 a month, all right? And then the taxes and insurance, I did not include it in the expenses because, as I made a note, it's included in the mortgage payments, okay? So if I wanted to break that out, potentially I could drop the mortgage payment to just the TI, and I could roll the taxes and insurance over into the expenses and thus the NOI. But really it's, we're just shifting it from one side to the other. Personal preference, okay? There is no right or wrong way so long as we're accounting for these things. So any questions on this math, now that I actually went into some numbers and I showed you questions here? You love my deal. if you hate my deal, just throw me something in the chat here. Let me know what you think. So Shelly asks, wouldn't your down payment matter for the mortgage? Yeah, of course it does. And so there's this whole other side. Okay, so what I did on the previous slide, and even right here, I talked about the NOI and how we calculated the NOI. What I didn't talk about was how we calculate the mortgage payments. Okay, and of course, this is how it goes. Is you have one formula, but there's a whole lot of other formulas that potentially go into figuring these things out, right? And so yes, what I did get a mortgage, right? As is clear because I have a number here. And what I did was then I knew, so a little bit more detail about this property. I bought it for $200,000. Little extra bonus. When we got it appraised, it was actually, the appraisal came in at 240. Awesome, I'm walking into some serious equity there. And then, but what I was gonna do, because I had saved up some pennies, I was gonna put 25% down. And so $50,000 on a $200,000 purchase, right? 25%. So my mortgage was gonna be $150,000. And then at whatever the interest rate was, 4.625, I think, when I got this mortgage, and then taxes and insurance and all these other things, 4.625% on a $150,000 loan, yada, 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 equals $905 a month. So yes, there's a little bit of extra work in there to figure out that mortgage payment, but that's how I did that. Now there's certainly apps, you can go to different websites, you can Google mortgage calculators. There's ways that you don't have to necessarily call a mortgage lender to figure this out. It'll get you close enough, but that is certainly something there. And yes, the down payment is factored in, but it's just looking at the monthly cash flow. Okay, so I don't want to be jumping ahead and start talking about cash on cash returns or anything like that. We will cover that in a second. And so some folks were definitely excited about this deal. I got to be honest, I was pretty excited about this deal. But something to note, without going into like a full-on case study about this one property, there was a tenant in there. The tenant was on Section 8, and so this 1896 is kind of guaranteed. And they had been in there for at least 2 years, and there was definitely some deferred maintenance. Okay, so I see a question about the $95 into a savings account for future use, and that's really important to understand because I knew there was going to be more expenses. The tenant was already there. The tenant wanted to stay, so I was not going to do any repairs because they didn't need any repairs. They were comfortable with how it was, but I know that at some point in the future, I'm going to have to repair this property. And so specifically, do I move that 95 into a savings account or something else? Now, this again is very nuanced about how do we run our businesses. And so for us, my wife and I, we both have jobs. We both make some decent money. And so we don't need this cash flow to live on. And if we don't need the money to live on, then I'm not pulling this cash out every single month, okay? What I'm doing is I have a business account because I operate it as a business, and I just leave all basically this 449 in this account each month, and it grows and it grows and it grows. And then eventually it'll get to a point where there's enough for another down payment and I can buy another property, or it grows and grows and grows. And then I need a new water heater. And so it drops a little bit, and then it grows and grows. And then there's a turnover, and then there's a $20,000 bill, which is a different property that I just went through this year, was a turnover on a rental property. And so for me, that's how I do it. Now, for others, yeah, you should definitely be setting it aside. And that's why we have it here in these expenses. And whether you move it to a different account, whether you just mentally know that this is here, whether you use QuickBooks, and so it's all in one account in the bank, but you have multiple ways to account for it in QuickBooks or something like that in your accounting software. It's totally up to you and how you want to do it and what's best for you and your business and any partners. But understanding those nuances is going to be important, and making sure ultimately at the end of the day that you are putting money aside, because these properties will cost you money over time, 100%. So a couple other things. This kind of return is rare. Yeah, I think so. That being said, it was the first property I looked at when I got back into acquisition mode, and I, kind of put my team back in ready mode. And I said, all right, we're ready to buy another one. This was the first one that popped up. So maybe that's because I have a really good team around me. Maybe it's because just really dumb luck on the timing. I don't know. I'd like to think it's because of the team I have around me. But yes, I would agree. They are pretty rare. And that's why I did not hesitate. It was on market And so specifically, the property had fallen out of contract twice. And so my agent had been tracking the property because we liked it, or they had liked it. And it got to a point where they were communicating and following up because the agent had other clients that would be interested in something like this. And by following up with the listing agent, they knew that this property was probably going to fall out of contract again. And so understanding what they were willing to take and what the moving parts look like, and then communicating that to me. Yes, when this falls out, I want to make an offer. These are the numbers I want to use, and I'm comfortable with it at this purchase price because of this rent, and I did all my analysis. Turns out, if it did fall out of contract, we swooped in, made that next offer, and we got it under contract. And so that probably goes back to having the right team around you, which again is a completely different topic, but very important nonetheless, right? Having the right people working with you. Yes, I did use an agent. I am not a real estate agent, but I do work with one. I actually have a couple that I know and work with. Well, I know many real estate agents, but yes, one in particular was the one I called up when I was getting ready for this one, and that is how I got this deal. All right, cap rate. So cap rate is used to compare deals with different valuations. So a lot of times we hear cap rates referred to in the commercial sense, okay? And so when we're talking in the residential world, the formulas are all still the same. And so cap rates can be used to compare different valued properties. So if you're comparing like a 20 unit apartment building versus a 10 unit, okay, a cap rate might help you see which one might be better. But in the residential world, it can still help you decide between deals or understand between a couple deals. So like if you're looking in a higher price point area, maybe a $500,000 purchase price, and you're trying to compare which one should I move on versus one in maybe a first-time homebuyer price point, right? $200,000. Using cap rates might help you decide which one you should be moving on. Now there's probably lots of other factors if we're talking different neighborhoods, different sizes, qualities, right? Lots of other things to play into that, but this is one thing on the numbers that will help us, okay? And so cap rates are based on the income it generates. And how do we calculate it? We look at the NOI, again, the same NOI we were using before, and divide it by the property's fair market value. Typically it's their purchase price. So that's what it would look like. NOI divided by fair market value, could be the purchase price, equals the cap rate. So now, again, some nuances. The fair market value could mean your purchase price. If you're going to do something like the BRRRR strategy, or it just needs some repairs, you're not trying to get anything too fancy, maybe the fair market value you're going to use is the purchase and the repairs, or maybe it does significantly increase the value doing these repairs. And so you want to look at the ARV of the property, okay? Some folks will roll with closing costs because those are actual costs into their formula. And so there's not necessarily a hard and fast way. The most important thing here is that you're consistent every time you're doing this, especially if you're going to use a cap rate to compare property A versus property B. You want to have those formulas be consistent, okay? A couple other questions. Back to the previous slide, I think, for the expenses, variable costs like repairs and vacancies. Do you change the 5% rule depending on every deal? You could, if I know like this property specifically, a lot of deferred maintenance, if I was budgeting a different way, if I wasn't just putting all the cash flow into an account and letting it just sit there and grow every month, then yeah, I would probably be putting more aside for that property because I know it's gonna need more work. When I walked through the property, there was a cabinet face that was just missing. Okay, so there's definitely some work there. You could see that there were some leaks in some of the sinks and faucets in the bathrooms. Okay, that's probably gonna come up sooner than later. Everything seemed dry when I was buying it. Somebody was living there and using it, so it was okay. But was it repaired properly, or maybe they just didn't use it today and cleaned up the mess because I was walking through it? I don't know. I did know that there was they weren't using PEX, but they were using like a flexible tube. It wasn't copper. And I know that there were some issues with that stuff. And so I know that I'm gonna have to repipe the place eventually, or at least be ready for leaks because that is what this type of piping was known for. So I gotta set money aside for that. So yes, depending on the deals, potentially I would change that. Now I'm in Denver and Denver is at historically low vacancy rates, like 1.5%, 2%, something like that. But over time, the average is somewhere around 5% vacancy. And so that's what I put in there. Conversely, we're in great times, right? Very, very low vacancies. It could easily flip-flop to 10, 15% vacancy, okay? And so, but the average is about 5%, and that's why I put that in there. Another thing, isn't it possible to get these deals without a realtor, a deal between just you and the seller? Yeah, of course it's possible to get these deals. But for me, I didn't want to do all the marketing. I didn't want to do the door knocking. I didn't want to have the kitchen conversations. I didn't want to have the mailers. I didn't want to put post-it notes on doors. I didn't want to do any of that work that folks could do if they want to find an off-market deal. I knew I was ready. I knew I had a good team around me. And so I called up the team and said, hey guys, let's get going. I want another property. And boom, set the wheels in motion, and they just did what they do best. And so is it possible? Absolutely. Did I do it on this one? Absolutely not. So do you have a contractor that you work with to estimate repairs, or have you just learned this as you've worked through deals? So really, I've just kind of learned it as I've worked through deals, especially as a hard money lender, being full-time for over a decade now. I've just kind of learned it. We financed probably 1,600 deals now. And so that is a lot of properties I've looked at. That's a lot of scopes of work I've looked at and double checked. That's a lot of clients that I've been talking to over the course of their deals. How did this go? How did that shake out? And so I'm always looking at scopes of work. I'm always looking at properties. And so I'm always getting more and more comfortable with what is going on regarding repair budgets. So, but if you don't know, one, absolutely call a contractor and have them go through it with you if possible. And two, practice on your own home. Walk around your house and see all the different things in your house, and then go to like Home Depot or Lowe's or something like that. And go and see, like, in my bathroom, what do I have? I have a sink, I have a faucet, there's a bunch of pipes underneath it that connect everything, right? There's a toilet, there's tile, there's the shower, right? All these things. And go to Home Depot and say, okay, here's this, here's this, here's this, here's the pricing, okay? And that's at least the material costs. And then of course we would have to pay somebody to do that work. And so usually at Home Depot or Lowe's, there's a contractor buying stuff at the same time you're looking. So ask around, talk to people, network, and find out, hey, you look like you might do some plumbing. How much would it cost to have this done or install this or do that work? Or just what do you charge per hour? And then from there, you can kind of back away into the labor costs. All right, so let's look at a cap rate here on this deal that we were talking about. Oh. Did I already do this slide? No, cap rate, boom, boom, boom. Yes, okay, so the higher the cap rate, the better the deal, okay? So that's an important understanding there. When we're looking and calculating this, again, first off, what's my minimum criteria for a cap rate if I'm going to use a cap rate formula? And then of course, understanding that the higher the cap rate, the better the deal, okay? So I put it in. Okay, so the NOI, right? We'd already calculated this from one of the earlier slides, $1,354 a month. Fair market value, my purchase price in this case, was $200,000. So that equals a cap rate of 6.77, okay? Now, some people were looking at, in the cash flow, they were loving the deal, okay? They were loving how much cash flow it looked like I should be getting. And then so to pull that over into a cap rate, if the cash flow was pretty good, then the cap rate should be pretty good, okay? We're kind of just comparing those two things. Now, something really important to point out here, the cap rate does not take into account any kind of debt, any kind of mortgage, okay? This is just how much income versus what is the value, okay? So it's a really important thing, because if you're gonna use a hard money loan, if you're gonna use a private money loan, if you're gonna use conventional financing, if you're gonna pay all cash, right? All these things have different influences on our cash flow. But if we're trying to compare apples to apples outside of the financing, that's one of the big reasons we would use a cap rate, okay? All right, so let's jump over into the GRM and the 1% rule. So what I'm looking at here is the rent versus value, okay? So a GRM is the gross rent multiplier. And the 1% rule, if we've all heard about that, you can quickly Google it. Basically what the 1% rule says is you want your rents to be equal to 1% of the purchase price. All right. So let's dig into these things. Why do I have these on the same slide? Because they're actually the same formula, just the analysis is kind of reversed. So, excuse me, for a gross rent multiplier, we're going to look at the fair market value divided by the rent equals the GRM. Okay. So just the gross rent, the 1% rule. Again, we want the rents to be roughly 1% of the value or the purchase price. And so if you notice here, the rent is on the bottom or the second part. And then down here for the 1%, it's the first part. And then the same thing for the fair market value, okay? Since that's what I'm saying in our math, we're just kind of flip-flopping some things. So they're the same, but they're inverse, okay? A lower GRM equals a higher 1% rule. And the lower the GRM, the higher the 1% rule, the better the deal. So now I want to point this out because certainly you don't want to be using, you could, but you don't have to use every one of these formulas that I'm talking about. What you probably want to be doing is figuring out what works best for you. What's important to you in your investing, and then finding the right formula that will help you figure that out, okay? And so I say that because these two are basically the same exact formula, okay? They're producing almost the same exact thing. So let's paint this picture here a little bit. Again, with that same deal, let's look at this. $200,000 was the value of that property I bought, and it rented for $1,896 a month. So the GRM, the gross rent multiplier, is a 105. Okay, that's how we would say that. It's a 105 GRM, or GRM is 105, gross rent multiplier of 105, right? That's kind of how we say that. And then for the 1% rule, we're gonna take it, right? We're gonna switch the numbers. 1,896 divided by 200,000 equals, now it's not 1%, but it's pretty darn close, 0.948%, okay? So the 1% in this case would be if it was 2,000, okay? $2,000 a month in rent and a $200,000 purchase price would equal 1%. It's a little less, the rent is a little less, and therefore the 1% is a little lower. It's not 1%, right? It's less than 1%. So that, and because these things they're inverses, right? If 200,000 value, and if rent was $2,000 a month, then that would be a 100 GRM. So a 100 GRM is 1% rule, okay? So again, just something to know, not saying 100 or a 1% is good or is what you should be shooting for, or if you have a 110 GRM or a 0.9, the 1% rule doesn't make that good or bad, but these are the things that we have to be figuring out for ourselves, right? Because these are quick. This one specifically is a really quick way to be looking at, okay? So Larry jumps in, is that rent?
I have a question right here.
Oh, somebody's jumping in, yeah. No, don't apologize, I love it. What you got?
I apologize if I missed you saying it. I am confused about what the gross rent multiplier is for after you figure it out.
It's a data point, right? It's another way to analyze the deal. If you know, because through your networking, through talking to appraisers, through agents, through whoever, your property manager, and everybody's saying, you've got the 1% rule in your head, because you read that on Bigger Pockets or something like that, but everybody's saying, oh yeah, in this town, we have a gross rent multiplier, you can expect a 120 GRM. Okay, well, that's what we should expect in that area. So then what do? Well, you can plug this formula in, and if the normal in the area is 120, I think that's what I said, and this is a 105, right? Here it is. It's a lower GRM than what they say the market is, so that's a better deal. So that's a pretty good deal, right? Or I have a minimum criteria. It has to be at least a 95 GRM. Okay, well, this is a 105. 105 is higher than 95. Lower is better, so I will pass. I will not take this deal on, okay? So again, all of these things are just data points. They're different ways to analyze the deal. So this one doesn't account for any financing, right? It doesn't account for cash flow, anything like that. This is just a very quick data point because the property is listed and in the listing, it says it's rented at 1896. So I know that right away. And if not, I could potentially go to Zillow and say, hey, Zillow, what would 123 Main Street rent for? Oh, 123 Main Street should rent for, right? But now their rental estimate is pretty good and accurate. Okay. I know we all don't like the Zestimate, and I agree. But their rental estimate is actually pretty accurate. And so if Zillow had said it was 1896, okay, and it's listed, or I'm willing to buy it for 200, okay, and so I could do this really quick. Okay, I don't need to talk to a mortgage lender. I don't need to figure out, any other moving parts. I don't have to understand the expenses. It's just a data point that I can plug into my formulas if that's something I want to do. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
All right, perfect. Any other questions? Doing good so far? All right. Well, let's move on to the cash on cash return. So cash coming in versus cash going out. Okay, that's how we figure out our cash on cash return. And so this is, we got to, of course, get really into the weeds here, figuring out our cash flow divided by our initial investments. Okay, so this goes back to our financing, any down payments, maybe closing costs, okay? And then of course our cash flow, which we've already calculated. So now we're using, to figure this out, potentially a couple formulas to get us there. So the cash flow, in this case, for a cash on cash return, we're looking at the 1 year of cash flow. And I know somebody was asking, how we're looking at rents and all that stuff for the different formulas. So I kind of jumped ahead and answered that for you here. So the cash flow would be for 1 full year. And the initial investment would be your down payment, maybe closing costs, sometimes any initial repairs. Okay, so again, this is the most important thing here, is that you're consistent in your analysis, because what I like to do with the cash on cash return is then compare it across different investments. Okay, so I'm understanding how much cash do I have going out versus how much cash do I have coming back in, and I can compare that across different deals. So I want to make sure my analysis is the same. All right. So specifically for that deal, cash flow coming in. Now I took again that, my way of doing it, which is just the gross number, $991 per month, all right, times 12 months. That's how I got my $11,892, all right? So this is now gross cash flow for the year. My initial investment, I kind of left off the closing costs. I just knew I'd have $50,000 in down payment. Not right, not wrong, but that's how I was analyzing it. And so based on that, 11,000, almost 12,000 gross versus the $50,000 down payment is a 23.7% return. Okay, maybe that's good, maybe it's not. Again, it's just a data point. And so for us, first off, what are those numbers that go into it? Okay, I did not have any initial repairs. I did. There were obviously closing costs because I closed at a title company. I got a loan, right? So there's a couple thousand in closing costs that I could have added up here. Potentially, if I ran my cash flow based on, the net operating income and I factored in expenses, then this number would change. Okay, so potentially this could change dramatically. The cash flow goes down, the initial investment could go up. But again, the most important thing is that I'm consistent in how I analyze it, and then I know what number makes sense to me. If I want a minimum with my formula, a minimum of 20%, well, this is 23.7. Checks the box, I'm moving forward on it, right? If my minimum is 25%, this is 23.7, that's less than my 25, maybe I don't move forward, okay? So again, it's really important to understand what is important to you. Make sense? I hope so. Let me know if you have any other questions. Again, unmute yourself, jump in and start talking, type in that chat, let me know what questions you have. We are already 45 minutes into the 1 hour we have set aside. And luckily, I don't have too much more to go through, but I want to make sure I'm answering all your questions. Yeah, who's got a question?
I've got a question. So is it better for you to, in your opinion, to get your cash on cash return, or better to follow like the 1%, or is it a combination of the two?
Completely different. But that's a great segue into Coop's quick 3-step analysis. And here's why. So my first step is the GRM, or the 1% rule. So for a long time, I had it as the 1% rule until the folks I was talking to, right, my network, the ones bringing me these deals, were talking in GRM. And so it took me a little while to figure it out. And then all of a sudden it clicked. These are the same things, right? Just in inverse of each other. But I don't need to know any financing. I don't need to know any of these other moving parts. It's just really quick. What's the price? What's the rent? Is this hit my number, right? And so before I even get in the car, when I just get an email, right, what I'm hoping for, what I tell my team, my wholesalers, my real estate agents, right, any my bird dogs, right, whoever I have on my team that's bringing me deals, this is my minimum GRM. And so, and I like to use GRM now, because if you say this is my 1% rule, but you're not actually saying 1%, it can kind of get confusing. So that's why I started using GRM, because again, it's just a data point. It's not saying it is 1%, it's over 1%, it's under 1%. Is that good or is it bad? It's just, here's a number, and this is my minimum number. And that's why I now use the GRM. But it's pretty quick and easy to figure these things out. And whether my team gives me the numbers or I find them out myself, again, pretty quickly, I can go to Zillow and probably find out both, right? What is it listed for? And what is it rent for? I can do that quick analysis. And does it hit my criteria? Is my criteria 100, 120, 150, 95, whatever it is? I know I can plug it in. Yes, it checks that. We're good to go. Boom, let's get in the car. Let's go check it out, right? Let's set a showing on the property, whatever the case may be. Let's go see how ugly this thing is or how pretty it is. So that's my first step. Step two, now I'm gonna, once I get comfortable with it, okay, it checks that first box. I've gotten in the car, I've driven out there, I've walked the property, I understand if it needs some work, if it doesn't need some work, what are some more of the moving parts and nuances, right? I understand the neighborhood, all these other criteria for buying rentals that I may have. Now I'm gonna look at the cash flow. And I wait on the cash flow because the cash flow needs more analysis, whether it's the Coop's quick way, right, which is just the gross numbers, or we get more nuance with the NOI and stuff. Either way, it takes more analysis because now I'm bringing in debt into the equation. I'm factoring in the mortgage, okay, which means if anything, I just have to take an extra few minutes of getting out an app on my phone and plugging in some numbers. Maybe it's not that difficult, but it is a little bit extra work. And so I want to know if it's even worth pursuing that. And that's why that's step two. After I've gone out to the property, it hits the GRM criteria. Okay, now let's look at the cash flow. Is it still checking the boxes, okay? And so not everyone will. Some may hit one and not the other, and that's okay because everybody's financing is gonna be different. People may be qualifying for different interest rates, all these different moving parts. So it's okay to have a couple tiers, in my opinion, and so far it's worked out pretty well. And then the third, and this one comes after we bought the property, because after we bought the property, we know exactly what all those costs were. Did I have any initial repairs? What were the actual closing costs, right? And so what I can do then is figure out the cash on cash return, and then I can use that cash on cash return to show and compare to the different properties. Well, this one I had 50,000, this one I had 20,000, this one I had $80,000 into it. And so how are these things kind of comparing and looking today? And so that's kind of my three-step plan. The cash on cash doesn't necessarily make or break a deal, but you know, it's, for me, it is a data point and it's something important, you know, that my wife and I can talk about. And so that's my three-step analysis. Does not mean it's right for you. Sometimes I wonder if it's still right for me, but it's what I've set up. I know the moving parts, and this is how I move forward when I'm buying rental properties. And so really the question then becomes, first off, there's other ways. So if you have any other ways you like to analyze your rentals, I'd love to hear about it. Of course, whether right now and you unmute yourself, you get in the chat, or we just, you know, chat later on, I'd love to hear. But what is the process? Or what's your process? Is it similar to mine? Is it completely different from mine? Ultimately, we have to be figuring out our own process. And almost more importantly, what are the milestones that I want? What's the minimum criteria I want? Because just having that formula is important, but knowing what to do with it, especially with those results, that's really the most important thing.
Yeah, I'll add one more thing in there. The cap rate is also a stand-in for risk. So the higher the cap rate is, you know, that's the higher the theoretical return, but it's also a risk indicator. if you're buying like a 10% cap rate building or property in an area where everything else is 7, you need to ask why. I mean, yes, it could just be that you're getting a great deal on it, and if that's the case, okay, great. But if you've done no negotiation and you're at a 10% cap rate in a 7% cap rate area, that I would generally take a step back and either A, rerun your numbers, and B, ask why.
Yeah, and I think that's important. Anytime you see an outlier, whether the cash flow is super high, whether the GRM, feels out of line. Everybody says your GRM should be 120, and then I find this one at 105. Why? What am I missing? What's the moving part? And so, talking about different neighborhoods, you get better cash flow in some neighborhoods. Those are typically the lower end neighborhoods. And why would that be? Well, sometimes these lower end neighborhoods come with more risk. There's more turnover, right? The tenants are rougher on the properties. And that's that risk that Michael is talking about. Understanding these types of things. Is it the part of town where you can get a better return because there's more risk? Is there something with this specific property that has more risk to it compared to the rest of the neighborhood? So yeah, absolutely. There's more in these to your criteria and into understanding what this analysis could mean. Absolutely. And one of those things is risk, right? More risk, more reward. And so if all you see is more reward, is there more risk? That's a really good question, especially if you're going in that direction there.
Yeah, and I believe Shelly had a follow-up question on that. She was asking, is there anything that you use to find a comparable for these statistics in your area or anything like that?
Not that I have off the top of my head. I mean, you can find lots of statistics in all kinds of places. I mean, even just on Zillow or Redfin, the more time you spend scrolling through all the information they have there, they can certainly be telling you more and answering some of these questions, or at least pointing you in the right direction. And maybe that's a good place to start, is just start with something that we know, like a Zillow or Redfin, scroll through, and we start seeing these data points that they're mentioning. Then maybe I can jump over into Google and type, that type of stuff and see what other websites offer this information. And then we can dive deeper into, what other information do those more specific statistics-driven websites offer. I don't have one off the top of my head, but yeah, there's definitely a lot out there, and I'm happy to follow up with you, Shelly, if you have more questions on that type of stuff.
Yeah, I will add one point there for the cap rate. Excuse me. On the commercial side, you can generally find it's that type of information on things like on the listing site. So for a commercial property, because it's something like a cap rate is a standard, it's industry term, that will generally be included in the listing.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously verify, but.
Exactly. And again, it's just a data point, right? If this property I was looking at was a 6.7 GRM, but my criteria is that it's at least a 7 GRM, right? Because a higher GRM is a better deal. Then how can I adjust it to make that better? Do I just walk away from the deal, or is there something I can adjust in that formula? Okay, and so I can't really adjust, the rents and stuff, but what can I adjust for a cap rate?
Justin, I have a question for the estimated rent. In order to calculate the GRM, do you calculate the current, say if a single family is being rented out, do you calculate with the current rent that it's getting at, or do you, like you mentioned, possibly look into Zestimate or Rentometer? How do you calculate that estimated rent, or how do you know that I could get that 1% as rent?
Yeah, so specifically for this property, it was already leased. And so if I bought the property, I would inherit that tenant and the lease that they had signed. So I knew on day one, I had a tenant who was paying $1,896 a month. In part of my diligence was how long have they lived there and do they plan on staying? And then, okay, so they want to stay. They're already in there. So I'm already making, $1,896 a month in gross rent. And potentially I'll continue doing that. And so for me, for this property, I just said, that's all I need to know. This is what it'll generate, and this is what it should continue to generate. So that was it. If I'm looking at a vacant property and saying, well, what could it rent for? Well, that's when I'm going to go to Zillow and look at their estimate. I might go to rentometer.com and look there. There's plenty of websites that can help out with this stuff. You could call property managers and say, hey, I'm looking at a 3-bed, 2-bath in this zip code or in this neighborhood. What could this rent for? If you're comfortable with Section 8, you can get on the Section 8 website and say, in this neighborhood and area, a 3-bed, 2-bath, what does this rent for? And you can do all those things if it's vacant and figure out what that is. If you're inheriting a tenant, but the lease term is almost up. If you're inheriting a tenant and they're month to month, which means they're no longer on a 12-month lease, that 12-month lease has expired, and now based on the lease, they just go month to month. And every month we're basically assuming we're going to stay for another month as long as they keep paying. But it also means that in 30 more days, that lease could be over. And so if that's the case, I would be looking at those same types of things to estimate what is the fair rent in the neighborhood or for this type of property. And then where is the current rent? If I keep this month-to-month tenant at $1,100 a month, but the fair market rent is $1,500 a month, well, maybe after I buy the property, I'm going to be serving them a 30-day notice, getting them out, and then re-renting it for that $1,500 a month. So that might be something. Or maybe I say, hey, I'm the new owner. Good news, rent's going up, and now it's going to be $1,250 or something like that. And you can kind of play through that. So understand these types of things. Every scenario is a little bit different, and everybody's approach is going to be a little bit different. So again, first off, understanding how you can approach these things is important. And so it's a good question, but ultimately understanding what you want to do as an investor is going to be also important so that you can then plug the right things in and follow the right steps. So that's actually a good question there to figure those types of things out. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. And so we are quickly running out of time for our hour. I want to honor you and your hour commitment to me, and vice versa. And so quickly wrapping up here. So I do use a spreadsheet. I have a friend who put together a spreadsheet. I don't have time to go through it at all, but really we're plugging in some pretty basic stuff. And then the spreadsheet calculates a lot of these things for us. And so then you can pick and choose which one is important to us, but the math is already done. And so if you want to copy that, I'm happy to send it to you. I'll put my email up here in just a second, but if that's something you're looking for, definitely reach out and ask. And at the end of the day, you got to trust your gut when it comes to these things, especially when you're coming up with your criteria, your minimums. You're looking at the cash flow, and you're hearing on whatever website that $200 a month is acceptable, and to you that just doesn't feel right. Then don't use $200 a month. Find out what's right for you. Super important there. And then of course for Pine Financial, we are hard money lenders, and so if you need to know or want to know what we do, one of our loans is our rehab loan. We'll cover 100% of costs up to 70% of the ARV. So cost meaning purchase, repairs, and closing costs. So the rehab loan works phenomenally on the BRRRR strategy when you're buying rental properties. Our other loan is our acquisition loan. And this loan is a little quicker and easier. We just lend 90% of the purchase price, and that's it. So we don't, it's still for a fix and flip. It's still based on the ARV, but a little quicker and easier to get through. So if you have any interest in the working together and hard money and diving deeper into those loans and qualifying, shoot me an email, give me a call, and let's connect on that. Again, if you want some coaching and some handholding with buying rentals, if you want to dive deeper into this stuff, let's explore that as well. And of course, if you're interested in that spreadsheet, I'm happy to share it with you. Just drop me a quick email. So it's up there on the screen, justin@pinefinancialgroup.com. You can go check out our website, pinefinancialgroup.com. Call our office, 303-835-4445. Or if you just want to schedule an actual time with me, you can go to callwithcoop.com, and we'll actually schedule a time to chat. So thank you very much. I know that there's one or two things that I didn't quite get to, so I'll try and take a look at those things, but I don't know if I can get through it all. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you being on for this hour. I hope I added some value to you. Let me know. Drop me an email. Share your thoughts on this. I think I recorded it, and so if so, happy to be passing out the recording to everybody as well. So thank you again, everybody, for joining me today at lunch. And again, we keep these lunch and learns going through at least the end of the year, every single week, Wednesdays at noon Mountain Time. And I would love to see you on the next one. So with that, thank you, everyone. Appreciate you being here, and we will see you next time. Thank you.